This is Charlie Shrem, and you're listening to Untold Stories. Today I had on the show neurologist Dr. Daniel Stein. Amazing. We talked about the Florida medical cannabis program. We talked about cannabis in general. We talked about some really, really cool topics. A little bit different, not really crypto. Tell me if you like it. Today I have Dr. Daniel Stein. Dr. Stein, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You are welcome.
We were talking earlier, and I'm excited for this new concept. And the times that I've talked to you, I remember the first time I met you, I said, well, this would be a great show. When we sat and you talked to my wife and I about the whole Florida medical cannabis program. So thanks for being the guinea pig on this.
Sure.
I want to start off and tell you my first reaction to the program. So like most people who grew up north or grew up anywhere, how it ended up playing out and how things worked out, and how it was developed, and things like vertical integration, which I want to ask you your opinion on. At first, I looked at the medical cannabis program as a hurdle or as a transition to recreational. But now being in the program for almost a year, I have to say, my first reaction is that it's not that it's a hurdle. In fact, it's not very difficult to become part of the program if it's something that you actually really want to do. But it almost creates a soft landing for people who want to get into into not just the industry, but become a patient and start using. Do you think that a lot of people agree with me, and that maybe the medical cannabis, it could be the end all be all, or it's more of a transition to recreational?
Can I say the answer is both?
Because, it could be, yeah.
I think there's a subgroup of the population that uses cannabis to help with mood, relaxation, and those individuals are generally referred to as recreational users. But in fact, that is a medical indication. Dennis Perrone, one of the great activists from California, said that all cannabis use is medical because we're self-medicating even when it's for recreation.
It's true.
So there's that. And there's also a large segment of the population that's not familiar with cannabis use, now just being introduced to it as a medical alternative, let's say someone with cancer and so forth. So I think that for a large number of users now, they want to become legit. They want to get legal. They want to get their cannabis without taking risks on the, on the black market. And so, yes, they are entering the legal cannabis market as patients with conditions such as anxiety or insomnia or chronic pain. And that's great. But I also think that there's a large segment of the population that are not familiar with cannabis, and they're being introduced to it now as patients for the first time.
When they're being introduced for the first time, I almost cringe when I see, right now downstairs from my office is a CBD store. I almost cringe when I see that because I almost look at that CBD as in the CBD stores on their own is almost like snake oil. I know that's a little bit too extreme. But why did CBD and CBD flower get treated so differently and become so unregulated compared to
medical cannabis? Well, I think the main difference has to do with the risk of intoxication. CBD will not cause intoxication. It does have certain psychological effects. It can reduce anxiety and produce a calming effect, or actually, in certain doses, it can elevate your energy level and give you a feeling of being energetic or high without the psychoactive.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so a lot of people say that CBD is not psychoactive, and that's not accurate. CBD is psychoactive, but it's not intoxicating. So that's why, patients or wannabe patients will say, okay, CBD is great. It helps me relax. I mean, that's a psychological effect. It's just not intoxicating. And the powers that be, when it came down to regulating cannabis, felt that the CBD part of the plant should be less regulated, more available, because it was quote unquote safer. That's the difference there.
I understand that. and you've made good points. So the basic question is, and a lot of people have this question, is that does it work? I mean, when you go into a store like the one downstairs, the gentleman's a very nice guy, and I think he believes, his products. How could someone get the most out of CBD without being a medical cannabis patient or recreational? And I just want to start there because a lot of people don't want to take, want to take that first step. I know a lot of people who smoke CBD flower just because it makes them comfortable with, the next step.
I think the first thing you have to establish is that the products that vendors like your neighbor are selling are good quality products, because there's a lot of CBD products out there that are not what they portend to be. What you get in the bottle is not what's described on the label, for example, and it's produced in a way that may have certain toxins or other contaminants. So, number one, if you're going to buy a CBD product, you have to get it from a reliable vendor, make sure it's clean. So that's number one. When it comes to using CBD that's from a reliable vendor, you can get benefits. CBD is a potent anti-inflammatory, analgesic. Like I said, it can affect your mood.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's fine. I have no problem with CBD from a reliable source. But what we're talking about, Charlie, is plant medicine. Let's just say that. And the whole plant is really what is available from nature to help us. And the whole plant includes CBD plus all these other cannabinoids, including...
Can we talk about the plant for a second? I still don't... Most people... you have all these terms. You have terpenes, which I'm learning are actually, I didn't know that cannabis actually can taste. It's so cool. Can we talk about the flower and the plant itself, just from the first time, someone puts a seed in the ground or at a lab or whatever, and then it starts to sprout, stems or whatever. What happens? Because apparently it has to be a female plant, not a male plant. I don't know all of these things. Most people don't.
Well, I'm no botanist, but it's important when you're practicing plant medicine to understand at least some of what goes on there. So I appreciate that question, because I've been learning myself. I'm an allopathic doctor. I'm not a homeopath. I was trained in a Western medical school, and we learned nothing about plant medicine other than aspirin came from, trees and tree bark, and digitalis came from foxglove. But I had to learn all this from scratch myself, and I'm still learning. So forgive me if there's any botanists in the audience that have a particular knowledge about the thing that you were asking. But in general, you have female plants and you have male plants. And the female plants become pollinated and produce seeds. And then, of course, the seeds then grow into other plants. So it's okay, just
so only females. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Now you can eliminate pollination and seed production in female plants, and that's what sinsemilla is. The word sinsemilla means without seeds. And when we were growing up, finding that type of cannabis, that sinsemilla was important because it was more potent. The female plant puts its energy into making seeds when it wants to reproduce. But if you create a sinsemilla with no seeds, then that female plant expends its energy producing cannabinoids, THC, terpenes, CBD. So
is that what's used nowadays?
Yeah, pretty much all commercial cannabis is sinsemilla.
So then where do they get the seed? If they're not producing new seeds, then where are they getting their seeds? I mean, will it run out?
No, because there are seed banks out there, and that's a whole part of the cannabis industry.
Oh, I didn't know this. This is so cool.
Yeah, seed banks.
So wait, so people who want to grow at their homes, which I want to ask you about, it's not legal here yet. People want to grow at their homes. If they grow these, two plants seedless, then they run there. After the first harvest, is it over, or can it keep producing those same plants?
Well, I'm sorry, Charlie. Can you repeat that question?
The way I think I understand the plant, and I don't want to spend too much time on the plant, but the way I understand it is that when you harvest the flower, the plant is still alive. It just regrows. You're not killing the plant. You're not pulling it out of the ground. So you don't need, once you harvest with these type of seeds, it's not like the plant is dead and you can't reuse it again.
It is dead because when you harvest, you pull it out of the ground, you hang it up, and it has to cure or dry. And that's it for that plant. But before you harvest, what you can do is create clones, take cuttings from that plant, put it back in soil, and grow what you hope will be a genetically identical product to the original plant. And that's super important because right now, cannabis industry, cultivators are working very hard to create certain varieties of cannabis that will have certain effects, either, for medicinal purposes or for so-called adult use or recreational purposes.
Interesting, because that actually leads me into the topic of that vertical integration, which is a hot topic now, when it comes to, the ability for growers to come in. Like you have a grower who develops an amazing strain in California, wants to come in and license out. It's very difficult here. I think there's very few dispensaries here. I know that Vitacan has the Tikkun Olam, which is great. I have a shirt over there from Tikkun Olam. They're my favorite company. Well, that's the perfect example, actually. So you have an Israeli company based out of California that has developed only like 2 or 3 strains. One of them that I use for my for like the anxiety, and the Alaska strain. And what's interesting about the Alaska strain is it's scientifically engineered for its medical purposes. The high is actually not even that great. It's more for just like you just feel happier, the uplifting effect. So here's an example of like a product that I use for, or people will use for medicinal purposes, and have other products that they use for like recreational. You can have different types of products. But with vertical integration, it's not really possible to have these like licenses and growers. You can't even have a dispensary can't even subcontract out their like janitorial staff, apparently. So difficult.
Yeah. Vertical integration, just so we're clear, is the limitation imposed by the Florida legislature that requires that the growers also are responsible for processing the plant and selling the plant. So you can't come into Florida like you can in Colorado and open up a storefront and call it a dispensary. You don't have that degree of competition, and that results in higher prices. So the vertical integration in Florida limits competition and keeps some of the prices artificially elevated. It also reduces the variety of cannabis available, like you said. So yeah, there's limits, and I'm not a big fan of vertical integration, but I am a fan of regulation, believe it or not.
Yeah, and me too, which is odd because this is a crypto show, but in this situation, I am too.
Yeah, you want the products to be clean, and you want them to be free of pesticides and heavy metals and mold. And so, the regulation part is important. A lot of my patients will ask me that. They'll be like, well, I read about this terrible lung disorder that you can get from vaping. How do I know that the vape cartridges I buy at the dispensary here in Sarasota won't cause that problem? And I can tell them confidently that they won't, because there's no vitamin E, diluting the oil in the vape cartridge. And that's only a product of the regulation.
And that was a big issue with vaping. And people are still worried about vaping because of all the cutting agents. But like you said, it's regulated here. So regulation in this situation, is a good thing. With supply, that at least it's coming, the supply chain is completely set. I think it could open up a little bit more, though. I hope it can.
Yeah, I think it'll be good for other entrants into the market to provide other varieties of cannabis. Like you said, the particular variety that you found useful is fantastic. But if there's more varieties and those can be regulated, then I think it's better for the consumer overall.
You alluded to something interesting earlier with Western medicine. I find it kind of like interesting and cool the way the program was set up, not just here, but other places, how basically the doctors have become almost like the gatekeepers for people getting, the toll booths of getting into the industry. And these, like you said, here you almost have like, so you're trained in Western medicine, you're a neurologist, and then you have this like cannabis thing that we've known for a long time that it has medical benefits, but the studies have been almost non-existent just because it's not, it's federal Schedule 1. And it's so interesting how everything worked out, and how you now have shifted and have created a cannabis clinic. Can you tell me like how that all worked out? And did you get any feedback from your peers or colleagues in the, in your industry, in your space, in the neurology fields, for doing this?
Well, when I was practicing general neurology without any cannabis clinic availability, my patients would ask me about cannabis medicine because they had explored it on their own. They were self-medicating and they wanted to know my opinion. So for years, especially my multiple sclerosis patients, for years, they were asking me my opinion on cannabis use to reduce muscle stiffness. Just because we didn't have research going on in the United States, doesn't mean there wasn't studies going on in the rest of the world. Plus, we know that for thousands of years, cannabis has been used effectively for medication. So I had been asked about it for many years, and when it became legal in Florida, Amendment 2 passed in November 2016, I saw that as an opportunity. So I got my qualification, my certification, and started offering cannabis legally to those patients. And they were very happy to have that option because, conventional medicine falls short for a lot of patients. And when I made that offer available to not only MS patients, but patients with migraine or Tourette's, epilepsy, chronic pain, and other things, it was very well received by the patients, very well received. The community of doctors, though, the other Western trained physicians here in Sarasota were not 100% on board initially, but I had established credibility here. I've been practicing in Sarasota since '93, so the docs here knew that I was not going to offer something that I didn't think was safe.
Yeah.
I had some political capital. So I sent out letters to everybody. I was like, okay, I'm doing this thing. And I tried to visit the docs' offices. I was giving a presentation.
How many doctors were there in the beginning when so when we moved here, the program had already started, but I mean, how did the program kind of launch? How many doctors were there? Were you one of the first ones?
I was one of the first ones. It launched after the November elections beginning in January 2017. And there were a handful of doctors in Sarasota County, maybe 10 docs. And throughout the state, there may have been 100 or 200 statewide in the
Wow.
Yeah. And so I incorporated in April, actually. My daughter Juliet is a co-founder of our Neurology of Cannabis business.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And then we launched our clinic the following October. And I think that we were about around 500 in the state, maybe 600 max, the whole state. And so I did the numbers, and there's a huge need. There's a huge need for reliable docs to provide the service.
And how did was the program a little bit quirky in the beginning? It seems like now it's done pretty efficiently. Was it quirky? Were there kind of like hiccups and issues with how things were playing out?
Yeah. There was one time I remember I was online with the registry. The state manages what they call the Office of Medical Marijuana Use, OMM.
It's literally a public facing like Excel spreadsheet, which is great. It's so simple.
Right. And now it seems to be working pretty well, but I can tell you there were bugs, there were hiccups. And one time I was actually on the website and it shut off. And then a few minutes later, it came back on with a different design. So,
that's so funny.
With different questions and different requirements, and more requirements for the doctor in terms of, qualifying patients and dotting all the I's. And so it became actually a little bit more difficult for many of the docs to do the registration process. And a lot of those docs that signed up to do it initially have dropped out, actually. So
really?
Yeah. So even though the process is becoming more efficient in terms of patient use, the requirements are more stringent in terms of doctor use. So there's that.
It's very interesting how that, oh, my light's turned off. It always happens during the show. It's great, actually. I'm here in Sarasota. I'm on Main Street, right upstairs above Classico and where the office is, and you're here too. Cannabis really was put in front of the limelight during COVID-19. I love how we went from like cannabis being like you can get shot on the street by the cops for having, a joint, to being an essential business. It's kind of crazy.
It is. It's crazy, and it's good. It's good that that the government realizes that cannabis as medicine is required for many, many, many people. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of difficulty with the cannabis industry in terms of operations when it comes to government regulations. You are probably familiar with the banking limitations that the cannabis industry has to deal with. And so that's a big mess. But as far as
still a huge mess.
It's huge, right? And actually, I thought, Charlie, we might talk about that a little bit, and you could teach me something, because I'm curious.
They're all using cash. It's actually... so I'll tell you what they're doing. The cannabis industry is insane. It's finally here. The new Bitpay Card that I've been talking about for the past few months. I've been using the Bitpay Card since 2016, and Bitpay now has relaunched the whole program with such cool features. The reloading has no conversion fees to go from Bitcoin right onto the card, and you can load the card whenever and wherever you want to. It has built-in contactless pay, an EMV chip built in right into the card, and so much more. The limits and rates are amazing. This is a bank account in your pocket. Just download the latest version of the Bitpay app and you can order the card right in the app. I just did it. I went through the whole process, took 5 seconds. Check it out. Download the Bitpay app today. So you talk about all this cash, right? And what percent of the cash in America is actual like physical dollars? Very little. I think it's like 3% globally. And so a large amount of it is the cannabis industry. That's just cash. It's a very cash business. And now like they have CanPay, which is unbelievable. It's a payment processor just for the cannabis industry here in Florida. But so what they're doing, the cannabis industry, is that they set up these bank accounts that they don't touch, right? And then what happens is they get cash pickup from like Garda or any of these, Brinks, whatever they're called, the cash transit companies. Mm-hmm. And they can pick up the cash, take it to the facility. And what ends up happening is the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, I know because that's the closest one, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta actually ends up buying the cash from Garda. So then these dispensaries like True Leaf or whatever are getting wire transfers once a week from the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve is sending them the wires. It's
that's allowed, right? That part
it doesn't make any sense, but that's what's happening because there's middlemen. Everyone's making money along the way. There's people are doing compliance along the way. There's like a system for it. It's like China. They make a law, then they make a loophole, and they figure out a loophole, and then they create a law around the loophole. It's not a bad way to run a government, to be honest with you, because people are going to figure out the loopholes, so you regulate the loopholes. It's great. But I wanted to ask you something on the topic of neurology of cannabis that really people don't talk about. Now, I love cannabis, but I also realize that cannabis is not a miracle drug. It's not a drug. It's not a miracle thing in that there are no downsides. And people have to realize that. And it's something I want to talk to you about because, and this is why I really think that cannabis could potentially stay medical and, for a while, in that there are some negative things that a lot of people notice. And, the industry has almost like created its own self-regulated situations around this. Like, for example, one of the problems is you build a high tolerance very quickly. And a lot of people end up doing these things like T breaks, like tolerance breaks, which I didn't even know was a thing. So I took like a 2-week tolerance break. And what's really great is that you can completely start your tolerance all over again. But you're also like self-disciplining yourselves. You're teaching yourself to quit every, few months. What other not downsides, but that you go into like this the spiral of stress where it's like if you're using too much, you become depressed that you're using too much, that you're relying on it, so it becomes like a negative what are some things that people can look out for in advance to help them balance their usage to maximize it and do it in the most efficient way?
There are risks to cannabis use, and it's an important thing to address because in young people, for example, using too much cannabis, let's say before the age of 18 or even as a 12 or 13-year-old, if you use too much cannabis, and what is too much, but let's just say that you're not feeling confident socially unless you're high, or you have trouble learning how to cope or sleep or eat without being high, then you develop what's called a cannabis use disorder, CUD. And cannabis use disorder is a condition where individuals rely on cannabis to participate in day-to-day activities and occupy themselves with the task of acquiring cannabis. They're preoccupied with that. And they suffer socially if they don't have it. So even though they may know that they're not behaving normally with cannabis, they're avoiding work, they're not going out to certain social events because they'd rather be home. So that's a cannabis use disorder, CUD, and it's in the Bible of psychiatric disorders, the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical.
It's a real thing. I think
it's a real thing.
Everyone goes through it though at some point. It's how you find your jive, your balance, right?
Exactly. And if you're a young person, you don't necessarily have the frontal lobe function to help modulate those activities, then you're more at risk for a cannabis use disorder. You can't self-regulate.
I think self-regulation is something that you develop in your mid-20s. I think it's not even when you're 21. I look at myself when I was 20, 21, I had no self-regulation, but now I feel like I do, not just with this, but with anything.
Yeah.
Maybe because you have a future you care about now. Maybe that's why. I don't know. You have a lot more to lose.
You have more to lose when you're young. You're impervious. You can't hurt yourself. And let's face it. Cannabis makes you feel good, and it's a loop. It's a reward loop. And so, there is addiction. People in general can become addicted to cannabis. It can affect your social interactions. And, we have to be on the lookout for that.
I agree. I really, really agree. And it's something that when I was 19, a lot of people too, when I was 18 or 19, went through that spiral. A lot of people go through it too. So when we took the step to re-engage with cannabis again, we had to make a conscious decision to be on top of it and to make sure that we're still, you have to give yourself metrics of what you're of your life. And if those metrics start to change, it's not just business though, because you can be more successful in business, but also be less socially communication. So there's all these different things. Do you think cannabis would change? You think cannabis will change in the future, in terms of its form and function? Do you think we'll be looking at a different product 5 years from now?
I look at it as a renaissance. I believe that cannabis has for millennia been available to humans for a variety of reasons. And we're rediscovering that right now. During the last 100 years, there's been prohibition, and that's been awful. But prior to that time, even Eli Lilly was producing cannabis cigarettes for asthma patients and
oh wow,
and tinctures. So we're rediscovering those things, and I think that in the next 10 or 20 years, as all of the states in the United States allow cannabis use for adult use, it'll be a rediscovery. And I think that the traditional growers, the cultivators, the heritage growers, some people call them, will continue to produce a variety of cannabis plants that people will use. And so I don't think that's new. I think that's new again, because it used to be that way.
Yeah. It's just, it's still the same under the sun, or the sun remains the same, or whatever the term is. A lot of people in crypto are very similar and say now everyone's talking about Bitcoin, but in the future, crypto will just be part of everyday life. Cannabis, can smoking flower potentially become a niche thing and THC and CBD end up becoming part of like mainstream medication?
Yeah, I think it will. I think cannabis use will become mainstream in much the same way that alcohol is. There'll be regulations on age, patients, amounts, intoxication measurements to provide a certain surveillance to protect people from hurting other people. I mean, it's going to be regulated, but it will be available. And one of the varieties of cannabis that's, let's say, more artisanal will cost more, and that's like the microbrew. Whereas there'll be other cannabis that's more
the gel caps or whatever will just be sold at Publix or whatever.
Exactly, and so that's the future I envision.
Hey, so I had a great question. I forgot. No, maybe that's what I write them down, but I forgot to write it down because I was so engrossed in the question. You know what the question was around Schedule 1. So why has the federal government been so reluctant to even create a like probationary schedule to put cannabis on? Like, I guess what I'm asking is, yes, they've been very hands off. There have been letters under Obama's administration. There have been letters where the attorney general has written, like, I'm not going to touch this, but still reluctant. The most liberal president we've had in a while, Obama, like, still didn't take it off schedule and even talk about it. But then letting all these states develop all these programs, Department of Health, is running this program here. Why have they been so reluctant to just change the concept of like having drug schedules? Why is that even a thing?
Money, Charlie. It's money. It's the pharmaceutical lobbyists. It's the established political machine that prevents social progress because of greed. And it started in 1937 with the cannabis prohibition and the Tax Act before that, which protected industries that were afraid of hemp. They didn't want hemp to compete with their golden goose making paper. And I think Hearst was even involved in suppressing cannabis use because the Hearst Foundation didn't want hemp available to make paper. And the other thing is the social injustice part, because throughout our history, unfortunately, our government has used certain powers to suppress certain social groups throughout history. And cannabis has also been used, especially under the Nixon administration, when the Controlled Substance Act was written and Schedule 1 was developed, to use cannabis, not only cannabis prohibition as a way to protect industry, but also to villainize or attack people of color and from other countries. So that's it, man. It's the social machine that it's a social political industry out there that adds to the prohibition. It's awful.
It prevents
don't get me started on this.
It prevents the police from being able to pull over anyone they want, regardless of like skin color and things like that. That's one of my biggest problems too. When I was in federal prison, most of my friends were in because of cannabis reasons. I mean, I could literally name you like every reason. All my friends were. I literally tell right now, one of my good friends, he taught yoga 3 days a week. He owned a construction company, very successful in New Jersey. And he got caught with like a pound of weed. And, he's like, I don't know he didn't tell me if he was like selling it or using it or whatever, but I'm like, a pound? That's it? You got like 15 years or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's tragic.
Yeah. You have no idea. Well, you do have an idea, but and just the people I was in with, it's just heartbreaking to see their kids not even understand that they're growing up without a father because of a plant.
Yeah, and the social inequity, depending on the color of your skin and where you live was part of that. So we're still trying to fight for equality in this new age of cannabis commerce, because a lot of the disadvantaged communities that want to now become involved in cannabis commerce are having trouble breaking into the industry. They're having trouble getting loans because of the banking limitations. And, cannabis industry leaders in general are still white men. So
yeah, that's true.
It doesn't seem fair. And the people that are promoting cannabis laws nowadays, that are socially conscious, are sometimes opposed by people that are promoting cannabis industry changes that are more commercial. So we have now two groups of at least two of individuals that are trying to promote cannabis use. One is the more commercial, white man led, and then the other is the more social, traditional, open door policy. So that's kind of an interesting little nuance.
And that's the reason they don't allow even medical patients to grow our own. I mean, it's makes no sense why we couldn't be able to do it.
That's a perfect example.
Cannabis is so expensive. It's so I don't know how people afford it, to be honest. It's so expensive. Like to have a medical plan, a monthly medical plan, literally costs you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars now.
You hit it right there, Charlie. You hit the nail on the head. If you can't grow your own and you can't control your own medicine, really, what's the point? And this last year, there were two bills in Florida. One was backed by MedMen, which is now going
under.
It's going under.
MedMen and Sutera, they think we're stupid here. We know that the medical cannabis industry is not very big here. We're tight knit.
That's right. They wanted to maintain control over the flow of cannabis in Florida and not allow patients to grow their own. And then there was this other amendment that was being voted on that would allow more freedoms to grow at home. So, yeah, there's all that.
What was crazy is that I saw there was a very there was a recreational cannabis initiative for 2020. It was well funded and well put together, but it died very quickly. Actually, they pushed it off 2022. The reason being is because the backers were the ones, like you said, and it was the ones that pushed back on like high regulations. So the recreational law would have not allowed people to grow on their own, and it would have only allowed medical dispensaries to start selling recreational. So basically, and so the industry, which is the patient community, which is 300,000 people or whatever, there are very few forums that we congregate on to talk amongst each other, and we know that the dispensaries read those forums too, and we were very angry about the bill. We were extremely angry about how these things were going to go out. I have been very happy with. You see, Mr. Morgan, he's been very adamant towards legalization here, and a lot of libertarian people too are pushing towards it. Do you see that people are pushing towards legalization here because they want to use the product, or is it more for freedom oriented related people?
Well, I think in Sarasota, considering our demographic, our population is still a little older, and I think that they want the availability as medicine, so the cost goes down and they have more freedom. It's not so much the libertarian view, I don't think, but certainly there's both.
Yeah. What are the demographics? A lot of people think it's just 18, 19-year-olds
that are interested in cannabis.
I wish they would release the demographics of the total MMJ database in Florida. I would love to see what the average cannabis patient age, stuff like that.
So there's a website out there called Headset that provides those types of analytics for cannabis industry participants, showing what certain age groups are buying in certain states.
Oh, I see. This is cool.
Yeah. So all of that is out there, and it differs region to region, of course, depending on what the demographic is. But I can tell you that there's a spike of increased use in individuals that are in their 50s and 60s and 70s. It's not.
I got to pay for this.
Yeah. It's not what you.
It's not free.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Well, they have a great report for $500. You can get a report on all the sale. I kind of want the report. I don't want to pay I pay $50 for it, but I just want to see.
So
I'm just curious.
The one report that I was willing to pay for had to do with the drop off in medical use when recreational becomes legal, because I wanted to know how many patients I was going to lose when Florida voted positively for the rec. And it turns out that most of the businesses in Colorado, Oregon, and California that were medical lost about 30% of their revenue when those states went recreational. And that was an important data point for me. But getting back to the age use demographic, it's older than you would think. It's patients, there's citizens that are 30 and 40 years old are using, and then there's this spike in the 50 and 60-year-old age range.
That's so cool. And I'm on this headset website. I lost my light again. I'm on this headset website, and the number one selling product is a topical in California.
Topicals are great.
It's not even let me tell you something about topicals. I thought topicals were going to be the biggest gimmick about this whole thing.
No.
And my counter is just topicaled up. I think that's what I spend my most money on. The aloe vera suntan lotion is great. The topical cream for like rashes and fungus and things like that is great. But you know what works so good? The product that goes into your bloodstream that's for like neck and back pain, and the transdermal patches, the 3-day patches. Oh my God.
Right?
Unbelievable. Works better than even some opiates.
So this is huge. We're learning that different formulations of cannabis are better for certain conditions, and the topical works great for a lot of patients. There's cannabinoid receptors in the skin. And so
I didn't know that.
Even for local application, if you have a rheumatoid hand with swelling of the knuckles, you can put that topical right on there and get really good local anti-inflammatory relief without any intoxication. That's the beauty of it.
That's why I like them too, because I could be at work and I have the cream in my hand or whatever. It's really great. Are there any like real long-term effects that we see on our cannabinoid receptors? Like we talk about tolerance break and you reset that, but are there like long-term effects on the receptors themselves or our bodies or whatever? We just don't know yet.
We haven't seen any long-term adverse effects on receptors for cannabis users that, let's say that for this, we need to do a lot more research. So there's this thing called PET scanning, PET. PET scans can be used to measure receptor density in different parts of the body. So you can get an injection of one of these radioactive ligands, we call them, and they'll bind to the cannabinoid receptors. And you can actually see, for example, in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, that their receptor density in a certain part of the brain is lower than it should be. So that's pretty amazing. Oh, wow. That's amazing, right? So,
yeah,
then what you do is you give them cannabis, and that helps supplement their endocannabinoid system and provides more of a stimulus to help pick up the slack for where those cannabinoid receptors are low. And so that biology, that is so amazing, isn't it? I mean, that we're learning that kind of thing.
That is so cool.
But to answer your question, we don't know for sure if there's any long-term detrimental effects on receptor distribution, but we don't think there is, because those receptors, they recycle. They sit on the surface of the cell. If you use too much stimulation, then those receptors downregulate. That's what we call the.
So what's happening with the tolerance? Is that what's happening?
That's what's happening. Those receptors downregulate, and then you need more of the chemical stimulus, more of the transmitter, cannabinoid, whatever, to stimulate that cell. And then
how long does that take? Like, how does your body know? It's interesting because Bitcoin works in a very similar way, and I'll tell you how. But how does that actually work? And like, what's a time frame realistically?
It's days and weeks. It's amazing. Yeah, you can build up tolerance within really days. So that using cannabis on a regular basis initially actually causes a sensitization of the cannabinoid receptors. So initially, using for several days in a row actually gives you more of an effect. And that's why some people say, oh, I smoked pot when I was young and I didn't feel anything. That's because they didn't do enough on a regular basis. So some people have zero effect initially.
That's that first time it doesn't work. Is that true or is that a myth?
No. It's a semi-myth. It's some people. It's not everybody. If your endocannabinoid system is working beautifully, you can throw in some extra cannabinoids through smoking marijuana, and it has no effect on you.
Is there a way that a user can like balance his tolerance or her tolerance without having to take? So someone who's like using a topical cream on a daily basis, they're going to deal with the same tolerance issue someone who's smoking every day or needs to smoke more. Is there something that can a person use different products, different strains, is there something that you can cycle on a daily to weekly basis to continue to give yourself that tolerance?
It all comes down to the dose.
Okay.
If you reach a certain level of benefit using a certain dose and just maintain that level, you can avoid tolerance building up. If you maintain the dose, you maintain the effect, you reach a plateau.
How do you do that, though? How do you maintain the effect by maintaining the dose? Well, are you chasing the high, kind of like
Yeah, you're chasing the high. So for the majority of patients, we have to educate them to titrate up the amount of cannabis that they're using till they achieve a certain response, and then just stay right there. And the majority of people do not need to increase the dose to maintain that effect. But what they do is they increase the amount anyway. Yeah. So the tolerance is an issue for a lot of patients, but for most people, you can build up a certain response from a certain dose and maintain that actually.
That's so interesting how that can work out. Because I'm learning so many new things, and I think people are learning as well now how that all works.
There's this other thing, Charlie, that's important, I think, for not just your listeners, but for everybody to understand. There's what we call a biphasic response for cannabis, where you can start with a small amount and build up a certain effect. And then if you use too much, it actually gives you the opposite effect.
Yeah, we were alluding to that earlier. It's that downward spiral. You get the opposite effect. I see people go through that sometimes, and they quit for months because of it.
And then they recycle their receptors. They have that tolerance break, you said, and then they're good to go. And then they have to start out with a lower dose again, and that's fine.
Dr. Stein, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the show today. It makes me want to go. I'm going to go medicate myself after this. I got to finish work though first.
You are so welcome. Thank you. I love talking about this. Our mission is to educate and provide access, and I'm sure that this is helping in that respect.
Thank you so much. I completely agree. Educate and entertain. That's like my motto in life. Try to do the same, like E&E. I don't know where I heard that, but I can't take credit. But anyways, thank you again.
You're welcome, Charlie.